what I want to talk about here first is context. And part of the context of when these fires hit is that it's an emergency and that we try everything that we can to, mitigate secondary emergencies. And what happened last year during the 2017 firestorm was that the fires hit. Basically, we all experienced the collective trauma of what it's like to go through a fire like that. And then storms were on the horizon. And so there was the fear of this secondary disaster because, of course, we had thousands of structures that burned to the ground. And as we all know here in this group, all the toxic stuff that gets concentrated when it burns down turns to this toxic ash. So first and foremost, what I feel like I need to mention is that when it comes to the remediation strategies, when it comes to mycoremediation, which is using mushrooms, when it comes to phytoremediation using plants, bioremediation using bacteria, we do not have conclusive evidence that these techniques are working post-fire. And one of the reasons why we don't have conclusive evidence about how well or not these are working, these strategies, these techniques, working with these allies from nature, is because we haven't had a chance to actually set up controlled installations where we're testing and monitoring water and soil and tracking and managing our different strategies in terms of remediation so that we actually have hard data that we can then come to the community, and we can come to the scientific community, and we can come to the public and say, well, here's what happened, here's what works, here's what doesn't work. So I just want to start by saying that we don't have any conclusive evidence about about these working, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't work. And I'm going to get into that in a few minutes here. But what I really want to focus on for a moment is just the context, because one of the reasons why we don't have conclusive data about the efforts about last year's firestorm and what we did in response to that was because we were in an emergency mentality. And that emergency mentality really drove us to do whatever we possibly could do to protect watersheds, to protect water supply, to protect water systems. And one of the easiest, cheapest, and fastest deployments of a technique are those straw wattles. One, wood chips. Let's see, where do I have that in here somewhere? We've got straw wattles, we've got wood chips, we've got straw, and maybe in some cases some kind of seeding, hydro seeding. So these are our low hanging fruit techniques and tools that we can implement quickly after fire. And some of the things that we're trying to accomplish here are keep toxic ash from flowing out of burnt structures. So when a structure fire burns, the building burns down, and often it's a pile of ash, often sitting on a foundation. And so one of the things that a lot of folks were doing last year was just waddling right around the foundation, right? Just trying to keep it as contained as possible, the toxic ash. The other strategic implementation of these techniques is to look at where are the sensitive watersheds, the watersheds that have endangered species, the salmonic watersheds. What are the water supply? Where are the water supply systems that we need to protect, whether it's water that's supplying for a city or a community? So these are areas that we want to get in the ground quickly and try to keep toxic ash and toxic material from flowing into these systems. So when you have a fire that's burned many thousands and thousands of structures, the scale is just so large that one of the things that is clear is that you're not going to be able to get to every zone. You're not going to be able to protect every last bit of waterway. You're not going to be able to necessarily put a wattle in front of every single rain gutter or in front of every culvert that flows into a creek or a river. So one of the things that we have to do in these post-fire situations is be highly, highly strategic and choose areas to take action that are either going to have the biggest leverage point, the biggest sort of bang for our buck in terms of protecting watersheds, protecting water systems, but also that in the case of mycoremediation, say using mushrooms, or in the case of phytoremediation, say using plants, if we really want to gather data on those techniques to see how viable they are, then we need to implement in locations that we can come back to, that we have access to, that we can test and monitor and document for at least 2 seasons to see what happens and to come up with something conclusive that we can actually use to communicate to the community. So these are some of the challenges when you have the context of emergency, when you have the context of collective trauma, and just doing whatever you can do, just get out there and get shit done as a way to protect our community. When you're in that mindset, you're not necessarily thinking about scientific methods. You're not necessarily thinking about integral protocols to document and track all these things. And then the other piece is that what happened with a lot of folks, and it happened with me in the community here, people have lives. Like, I have a family, a lot of my family evacuated during the fires, and they were living in my house for over a week. People have jobs and businesses and organizations. And so what happens is, unless you're in an organization that has funding to fund you or support you, or you're independently wealthy where you can be on the ground volunteering doing this work every single day, the reality is a lot of folks don't have the time and energy to do that unless they were somehow funded to do it. And so you're out there as a volunteer doing everything you can, and after a while it's just hard to hold energy past the emergency. Once you get past a few weeks or even a couple months and the emergency side sort of dies down a little bit, there's a sense that people want to return to normalcy. They want to return to their lives. And so it's been difficult to hold the energy all the way through, which again is another challenge in how we track the viability of different remediation methods. So that's to give you a little bit of context of what happened last year. Now, I think in Sonoma County, we were so blessed and so lucky to have such highly competent and motivated organizations, city councils, county supervisors, the water agency, nonprofit organizations. I mean, we literally had two organizations, Marin Compost and the Wattle guys, I think is the name of them, literally just making wattles every day, making thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of straw wattles to deploy out into our watershed. Now, I think it's unlikely that many communities are going to have those kinds of resources and those kinds of people who can actually just start custom making wattles day after day to be able to supply the needs to realistically respond to the scale of a post-fire, post-mega fire. So I think this is one of the challenges that we have is being prepared with materials. We were extremely prepared, amazingly, magically prepared in Sonoma County, and I think it's unlikely that other communities are going to have those kind of resources. That's something a group like this, folks who really want to see a fire remediation action plan, that has data that is viable, that is realistic, that we can respond as soon as a mega fire hits. We already know what it is that we need to get together. We have a team in place. I'm going to get to that in a moment when I talk about planning going for the future, if we actually want to implement remediation at scale when we need it after a mega fire. Janelle is saying we're working with Fish and Wildlife to set the pre-approved access areas that are in critical zones. That's great. So, I mean, just being able to work with organizations or work with Fish and Wildlife. I mean, that's one of the opportunities. I hate to use the word opportunity when we're talking about catastrophe, but it's one of the opportunities that does rise up is the ability to start cross-pollinating with institutions, with government, with organizations, with cities, with counties, and start to get approval for some of these more ecological methodologies implemented faster. So I think that there's a lot of groups and organizations in Sonoma County, like Daily Acts, like Sonoma County Conservation Action, like the Clean Water Alliance. These are 3 organizations that stepped up in incredible ways last year, that really brought together the full spectrum of the community in an organized way. And I would love to see the playbook on that. Like how do we bring and unify and create coalition around responding to fire? What are some best practices? Who are some contacts at the state when the next time the fire hits in California that we can contact right away and put into our citizen action remediation plan, right? So part of, I think, what from what we experienced in Sonoma County, what you all are experiencing in Butte County right now, is we're basically having some, we're learning through the fire, right? We're having some by the fire experiences where these experiences hopefully can help us lead us to some kind of roadmap, some kind of planning mechanism that will allow communities in California to respond faster and better after the next mega fire, and a lot less questions. And that's part of what I'm trying to do here, is to help provide some fodder for that map for moving forward. Welcome everyone who's joined so far. And one thing I just wanted to say is that my camera isn't working, so I'm sticking here with this little presentation. Also, I just wanted to say, if you missed it, that I just kind of started by just letting you all know that in terms of the micro remediation and what we did in Sonoma County last year, there's no conclusive evidence that helped in any way. And so I'm going to break down how we could move forward if we want to start learning about what kinds of remediation strategies work and then implement them. So I'm going to get to that in a moment. There's a few other things that I want to point out before I get into the details. One is the wildlands versus urban suburban piece. So someone made a comment in the group the other day about, they were in Sugarloaf and they, asked about remediation, and someone said, oh, unequivocally, no remediation happened here. I think that's great. It's clear that the wildland fires that are happening in parks and on ranches and things like that, it's clear that those are, oh, Matthew watching through Janelle's Facebook. Okay. Hey, Matthew. So it's clear that, when the fires are happening on wildlands, like, the landscape of California is a fire ecology, and it wants fire, right? Like, these lands that are burning, they have been needing fire for all their different, to sprout seeds, to clean out underbrush, to kill disease, to alkalinize the soil, to transform nutrients, to bring potash into the soil. There's all kinds of benefits that fire will bring in ecology. And I've walked in a lot of the wildland post-fire areas in my zone in Sonoma County, and it's amazing to see all the native bunchgrass and native wildflowers in a lot of areas. Some areas are seeing a lot of invasive species like Scotch broom and stuff, but other areas are seeing this amazing flourishing of native plants and wildlife. And what I want to say about the wildland areas is, those are the places where we observe the natural processes, right? This is where we can learn from nature about post-fire. And if we can take the time to attune to what's happening in those wildland areas after fire, we can use that as inspiration, right? For those of us who are permaculture designers, it's like we look to nature for solutions, and we want to utilize the biomimicry principles when we're thinking about development or management of human systems. And so, so these burned wild areas are places for us to learn, to listen, and it's really not for us to go in there and intervene unless we're dealing with erosion caused by human activity. Roads, runoff, things like that are places where we might want to intervene, culverts, things like that. But otherwise, we're not talking about the wildlands when we're talking about fire remediation. We're talking about the urban suburban lands. We're talking about when you have thousands of structures that burn to the ground. How do you protect the watershed and protect the community from all that toxic ash flowing in there? So that's the context for the rest of the conversation, is those kinds of areas, not wild areas whatsoever. So when we're thinking about handling those toxic materials, it's really about water. It's about water runoff, because this is the secondary crisis that we're trying to protect against, to avoid, is polluting our watershed, polluting our water systems, and the catastrophe that can happen from that. So here are a few ways that when we think about water that we can do specifically relative to water. We intercept runoff. So that's what these wattles often are used for, is to just intercept runoff, just so that you slow it down. When you slow water runoff down, whatever it's carrying ash, it's carrying sediment, whatever, it's going to get deposited behind whatever you're using to slow it down. So it'll get deposited behind a wattle. Or if you put a log on contour, if you're out there cleaning up dead material that was burned and you're cutting down tree hazards, well, if we can drop logs on contour, get them in ground contact, now they become like a wattle, and they help slow down water runoff and catch any kind of material that's in the water before it goes into the watershed. So another one is shunting water from roads, trails into contour systems. So a lot of our roads, a lot of our trails are these impervious structures that when it rains, the water's gonna run off really quickly, and it's gonna carry whatever pollution that's on that surface with it. And so if we can cut little water bars, we can put rolling dips in. Again, you could use a wattle, you could use a speed bump. What can we do to get water off of roads and trails faster at smaller intervals, like let's say every 50 feet or every 100 feet, depending on the slope, depending on the scale. Get the water off of these impervious structures so you can slow it down, and then get it into some kind of contour system. Maybe again it's a wattle, maybe again it's a bunch of straw bales on contour, maybe again it's a logs or brush on contour, or maybe you're actually digging a contour swale and you're putting the water in that way. So a lot of our strategy with post-fire management is just managing water. That's like foundation one is we're managing water. And like I had mentioned before, we want to focus on strategic locations, storm drains, confluences, watersheds that have endangered species, water systems, secret springs. What are the strategic locations, so that, because we know that the scale of these fires is so big and so large that we're not going to be able to handle the entire thing. So, but there's short-term deployment and there's long-term deployment. So right now, like for those of you up in Butte County, you're still in the short-term deployment where you're focusing on wattles, straw, wood chips, water bars. This is like, let's go fast. Let's cover as much ground as we can. We get one zone in, we go to the next. And that's what a lot of folks were doing in the couple months after the fires in Sonoma County last year. Now, long-term strategies are going to be looking at managing the biomass, contour brush piles, logs on contour swales, rain gardens. These are all long-term strategies. And let's be clear that just one winter isn't going to wash all the pollution away. I mean, this next year, the second year after the fire, is still going to be issues with pollution and sediment and runoff and all of that. So I want to context a little bit in presence that when we're stepping into post-fire remediation, that it's a long-term process if you want to see long-term success. And how we keep the energy long-term is a challenge. I'm really inspired by you all up at the campfire and the ecological restoration camps, and that y'all seem to really be focusing, Matthew and others, on creating a model that can be sustained over a longer period of time. Within that sort of context, now we can play with some of the more experimental strategies like mycoremediation, phytoremediation, and track and document that. So that's your water runoff piece. And then let's talk about actually remediating toxins. So one thing that we know from tests that folks did last year after the Sonoma County fire is there's a lot of different kinds of toxins, dioxins, heavy metals, and such, PCBs, that are potentially in that ash, right? So some of this can harm human health, can harm wildlife health, can harm watersheds and aquatic creatures. And so, these are disaster zones. These are toxic zones. And so one thing that is been a little challenging in this last year is, you see, one of the reasons why we talked up mycoremediation and bioremediation last year so much wasn't because we thought, oh, this is a silver bullet, this is going to solve all of our problems. That wasn't why we inspired the conversation around bringing mycology and bioremediation into the post-fire. It was because we felt like we need to use every single tool in the toolbox. Like, we don't know if it's going to work. We don't know how well it's going to work. But you know what? Since we're already deploying thousands of feet of wattles, we're already laying down tons of straw. We know that straw is a good substrate for certain mushroom species. So let's inoculate those with mushrooms. We know it's already scientifically been proven that certain mushrooms do accumulate heavy metal. Those scientific documents exist. And we know that they break down hydrocarbons in some cases as well. And so let's just do everything we possibly can. We don't know what's going to work. We don't know what's not going to work, but hey, let's just take action and get this done. So that's what we did. And we got a lot of press, and people were really excited about it because it's this idea that nature can heal our toxic world. And I think that nature can heal our toxic world. And I actually believe that a lot of these bioremediation strategies have merit in a post-fire in a post-fire plan. But it's just that because we did it in an emergency, kind of context, we weren't able to monitor or manage it. So last year's microremediation strategies really just turned into just get mycelium and fungi into as many straw wattles as possible and deploy them everywhere where we possibly can. Let's be as strategic as possible. And that's what we're going to do for our ecology. And we don't know if it's going to work or not, but almost 100% or even 100% of the mycelium was donated. So there was no extra financial cost to that. It's fairly easy to inoculate wattles. It doesn't necessarily add a ton of labor. There is some labor there, but the ability to inoculate wattles, to gather mycelium, especially in the Bay Area, those are not big energy sucks, because what we were really doing was we were making and deploying straw wattles, which was one of the core ways to respond. So it was just like a tack on. The mycelium piece was just a tack on to that. And so I just want to give folks context about why it happened the way that it happened. Now, the mushrooms got a lot of attention because I think people love, they're curious about mushrooms, and Paul Stamets has done a lot of inspiring work that people know about. So mushrooms got a lot of attention. But, when I started this group, the Fire Remediation Action Coalition, and first started to have conversations about this, this was only step one, was to let's just get mycelium into the wattles and just see what happens. That was just step one. But never were we promoting or saying that mushrooms were the silver bullet or the answer to everything, because clearly plants have a place in this. And if we look to our wildlands for inspiration, we can see that there is bioremediation happening on the wildland post-fire, but it's happening through bacteria in the soil. It's happening through fungi and mycelium. And I've got some great pictures that I shared last year of this pyro mushroom, this orange fungi that literally covered tens of thousands of acres of burned land right after the fire. It was so inspiring, so amazing. And there's a post somewhere down in the group from last year all about that. So that's clearly one of nature's ways of responding. And then plants, right? Plants also have an ability to pull up heavy metals, to break down toxins, and help us with our remediate any kind of toxic material. So when we talk about toxic remediation strategies, we've got to put it into the context that there's really these three pillars of remediation. There's microremediation, phytoremediation, and bioremediation. And when we talk about microremediation, we're talking about if we want to have success in that, then we're talking about very, very specific conditions, right? You're not just going to be able to inoculate a straw wattle with mycelium and then just put it anywhere in the system. We need to find places that are dark, that have continued moisture, that are, like not under redwoods, maybe under oak, maybe under pine. There's a lot of factors to consider if we want to have really, really successful microremediation projects, and maybe you're even covering them. There's a lot of different strategies to make it successful, but south side, on a sunny south side slope, with no cover and no moisture, unlikely you're going to have any success in doing microremediation in that kind of context. So we really have to deploy the appropriate strategy for the appropriate location. And in order to understand whether one strategy is appropriate for one location versus another, we need trained designers and ecologists who can, look at maps, who can walk onto sites and say, oh, this is a good candidate for microremediation, this particular zone, or this is really good for phytoremediation. And we can start planning this out in a way where we can have more success by ensuring that we're implementing the appropriate technology, biological technology, in the appropriate location. Um, so the other piece, and Matthew, I'm going to get to some of your comments and stuff here soon. I'm just going to get through this presentation, and then I'll talk with whoever's on the line here. So phytoremediation is plants. It's plant-based, and it's a much longer term approach. We're not necessarily going to go out in an emergency situation where the fire's still burning and a huge storm is coming tomorrow, and now we're going to go out and do a bunch of planting. It's probably not the best use of our energy at that moment. But to come back after things have settled down, to plant and within whatever variety of plants. If you're in the urban areas, even sunflowers pull up heavy metals. Sunflowers are amazing phytoremediation plants. Mustard is another amazing phytoremediation plant. Cattails are another one. So it goes on and on. There's tons of incredible plant allies that will pull heavy metals out of soil, that will break down toxins, break down pollutants, and we can be strategic by implementing those in the strategic locations where we can monitor them and see how they do. And so this is a much longer term approach. It's not something we're necessarily going to do in the emergency response phase, but in this just after emergency response phase. And some of the ways that we can do that is we can do it by seed. Of course, like, you can't plant sunflowers in the winter in California, so like sunflowers aren't a good one for wintertime planting, but mustard is a good one for wintertime planting. So let's be appropriate with the species we choose. We could do cuttings. Geranium is another amazing phytoremediation plant that will pull up heavy metals and break down toxins. So we could be doing geranium cuttings, or we could dig and divide rooted geraniums, or we could just get donated or plant established plants. So this is how we could bring phytoremediation in the mix. And then bioremediation, which really is talking about bacterial-based remediation, that is compost. There's a lot of conversation last year about different composts, compost with biochar, compost tea, other bacterial inoculants like lactobacillus. There's a whole set of bacterial-based materials in the toolkit here that we could use, and there's tons of scientifically backed data that proves that different kinds of bacteria can actually break down hydrocarbons, that can break down pollutants, break down dioxins, eat plastic. Okay, there's a lot of different bacteria that can do these things, and so we could get them out on the ground through some of these forms of compost tea, biochar, bacterial inoculant. I know last year there were wattles that were made with compost. So rather than a straw wattle, it was a compost wattle. So that's another strategy, another technique that could be implemented to help us with our remediation. So here we've got a lot of tools in the toolbox, whether it's bacterial-based, plant-based, or mushroom-based. And my personal feeling is that within these different natural allies, there's a lot of potential there for cleaning up toxins post-fire. I truly believe that. And it's our job now to come up with a plan to implement these strategies in a controlled way in the appropriate conditions, and then document it, track it, and scientifically prove that these are worthy strategies. And then maybe once we have documented proof of this, scientifically backed, then maybe we'll be able to get more funding. Maybe we'll be able to get a whole university lab that is just focusing on post-fire remediation strategies. Maybe someone monetizes quickly deployable different kinds of wattles that are inoculated with bacteria, or have certain kinds of seeds, that have a mustard seed in it. I don't know. It's time for us to be innovative. It's time for us to be creative, so that we can not do business as normal, and that if thousands of structures are going to burn down every year in California and across the world, that we know how to respond to this viably, and that we have a plan, and that we're not always like reinventing the wheel every time. So I really think that there's potential here. It's up to us to prove it. But in order to prove it, we need monitoring. Without the monitoring phase, then we're going to constantly have conversation, people are going to constantly speculate about it. There'll be no proof. So some of the ways we need to monitor it is, one, we need to have some kind of testing system where we're able to test water and soil to see what kinds of toxins are in that water and soil. Ideally, we're doing that before, for some of these longer term strategies. Ideally, we're doing water and soil testing before we choose one of these remediation strategies to implement. Because if we test the soil and it tells us that a particular kind of heavy metal is in there, or a particular kind of toxin, well, then we can be targeted in terms of choosing what strategy, what species, what variety of our remediation toolbox is going to be appropriate to in that particular area. So that's going to be a much better and more focused way of dealing with it. So that's one. In order to have water and soil testing, we need some kind of lab. And we also need a lab to grow out some of the bacteria, some of the mushrooms, in order to, as we get more data, we might discover that there's some particular bacteria or particular fungi that's really appropriate for these post-fire situations. And so we may want to grow that out. We need rigorous follow-up. So we can't just implement a remediation strategy and walk away and never go back again. We need to constantly be monitoring it. We need to follow up. We need to document it. We need to take pictures. We need to be testing before and after, and literally track all this information and data so that we have something real. And through that, use peer-reviewed scientific methodologies to do that. If we're serious about this, if we're serious about developing a post-fire remediation action plan that's peer reviewed, then we need to use the scientific methodologies that people agree with, and so that's important. And we need excellent mapping and tracking. And this is kind of goes back to the beginning, that we need to be able to map and track what's going on in the early stages of the crisis, or as soon as we are able to, so that we can start to develop the appropriate solution to a particular zone, right? I mean, the top of the ridge is going to have we're going to be looking at the top of a ridge differently than we are at the bottom of a valley. We're going to be looking at a north side slope different than the south side slope. So site-specific design and context is super key, and that's where our mapping and tracking is going to be important. And the other reason why we need the mapping and tracking is because if we are out there doing these controlled remediation projects, we want to be able to put on a map where it's happening, and then what is the protocol for that? Did we use bacteria in this particular zone? Did we use mushrooms? Did we use plants? What kinds of plants? What kind of mushrooms? How did we do it? All of that is tracking that we need, and we need to have it mapped out really well. Again, folks, I'm going to get to questions and all that here in just a moment. All right, Matthew. And then the piece that I think is, the Achilles heel for this is that this takes a lot of work, a lot of materials, a lot of resources in order to do this. It's not something that we can just self-fund. People have lives, families, businesses, careers, jobs, and so we need funding. We need volunteer-based teams. The problem with if we focus all of this on volunteerism, the problem with that is that at a certain point people are going to burn out and then they're going to leave, and we need to make sure that whatever information or data that people generated is tracked and documented, because then you have the situation where you have people show up, you have experts show up to volunteer their time. How beautiful, how wonderful. They put all this great work in, they do all these great things. Nobody really knows what they did. Nobody really knows where they did it. And then they leave because they have to get back to their lives. And then we don't know what happened. So if we are going to, currently volunteerism is the basis for a lot of this ecological work. I know that there's a lot of paid contractors and organizations and stuff that are doing a lot of aspects of post-fire cleanup. But when it comes specifically to remediation and proving biological plant or fungi-based remediation strategies, we're not at this point, I don't know if we're going to be getting government funding from that. I don't know if we're going to get FEMA funding for that. It seems pretty unlikely that this is low on their priority. So we need to come up with the funding ourselves in order to get the lab, to get the water and soil tests, to get the materials, to do the mapping, and to have that long-term follow through. So this is most likely the biggest Achilles heel that we have currently when we're looking about deploying a really a relevant fire remediation strategy. So that's about monitoring water runoff. Before I go to planning for the future, let me just say this, because I think this is as important as anything, is that what we really need more than any of this is to stop being in a emergency response state and actually get ahead of the problem. And that is really about being preventative. So this is going to be a cultural shift, a design engineering change, a decision-making change for cities and counties and statewide, national. We need to start building houses that without all these toxic materials. We need to start building houses that aren't prone to burn. And a lot of the houses that burned here in Sonoma County, there were some of the newer ones, they met a lot of the fire code, but they burned anyway. So even the current building requirements aren't necessarily meeting a standard where they're not going to burn. So, but there are ways of building that are less prone to burning and are less toxic, and those should have we need a much stronger movement to push those and advocate for those. Prescribed fire is one of our preventative tools as well, which is to strategically use prescribed fire at the right time of year to reduce fuel loads so that we don't end up with such catastrophic megafires. It doesn't mean we're not going to have wildfire, but at least it might reduce the catastrophe and protect some of our communities if we have strategic prescribed burns in strategic locations. In general, fuel load management, we've talked a lot about that, and obviously a lot of our forests have suffered over the last few decades with the lack of fire, so we have a buildup of fuel load. And of course, we're not talking about Donald Trump's plan necessarily of going out and clear cutting forests and cutting down old growth redwoods. When we talk about fuel load management, it's like way more complex than it seems, because I believe we do need management, but it's the kind of management is what it's all about. So it's sustainable thinning, it's understory thinning, it's fuel ladders and things like that. We also need to be designing our communities for water retention and filtration. If we designed better to mitigate and reduce runoff in our communities, then we wouldn't be scrambling so much to go and protect our watersheds post-fire, because we actually know that we have in place water retention systems within each landscape, within each community, that are going to protect those watersheds already. So that's another preventative method. And then one thing that I think we're doing now, and y'all up at Butte County with the campfire restoration team, you all are, creating an educated team of an emergency response team. And I think one of the things we need here as a response, here inside this group, there's 437 people in this group as of today, who are presumably interested in this conversation, interested in this work. If we want to get really serious, well, we actually need to start planning now. We can't just wait till the next fire hits. We actually need to plan when we're not in crisis mode, educate people, and be ready for the next fire. And I think that more and more, as we cross-pollinate with communities throughout the state, we have an opportunity to do this. I will just offer up that we have a site in Sebastopol, California at the Permaculture Skills Center where we can meet, conference, we can have materials there. I'm open to that. And so that's one site, at least for North Bay. And then I'm sure we need other sites around the state too for organizing and coordinating. So that's another piece that we need. So I'm just gonna get on this planning for the future, and then we'll kind of address all the things you're coming up with, Matt, and we can talk more. There. So let's just talk about planning for the future real quick, and then we can get into discussion, answer any questions, anything y'all need. So in terms of planning for the future, I already touched on a lot of this, so I'm just some of this will be review here. But one is we need to, let's see, where am I going to start here? All right. One thing is we need clear mapping techniques for planning ideal locations for various remediation efforts. So really what we're talking about here is a strategic workflow to respond to the next fire. What does that workflow look like? And I think we can develop it between our experience in Sonoma County and what y'all are doing up in Butte County. I think we can come up with like, what's that workflow look like? What's the mapping? Who do we need to contact? What are the issues that we're going to come up with? Obviously, there's a lot of legality issues. Like I know you all up in Butte County have dealt with, just like even getting access to zones that need support. So what are those first step kind of things in the workflow? And in my opinion, being able to have some kind of mapping, or even just looking at Google Earth, or tracking the maps that the press puts out around the fires, or that CAL FIRE puts out. How do we track that? How do we track the sensitive watersheds and the sensitive water systems, or the sensitive communities that are going to get hit strongest by a secondary crisis when the rains hit, like a mudslide or a toxic ash plume? So being able to have that, and in general, I think we're looking at, developing remediation teams for the next fire. Feels like taking the time to plan between now and when the fire season hits again, which this year was in June. Usually fire season doesn't start till August, September. So that's an issue that we're dealing with. But we need to start organizing folks in preparation for the next fire to hit California, so that we can have a handbook, we can have a workflow, we can have best practices, and empower the communities on the ground to get in and have success. We need to look for funding or sponsorship in order to achieve all of this. I'm willing to be a consultant and support in any way I can, but I also have 5 organizations that I run, and I have 2 young children, and I have a chronic health issue. And so it's like, I only have so much bandwidth I can do personally. I'm willing to do whatever I can, but we need a team of people who have energy. And really, I think it's going to take funding and not just volunteering in order to make that happen for the long run. We need a testing and monitoring protocols ready to go that lasts at least 2 wet seasons. So we need the lab, we need the testing lab, we need the workflow on how to test. What's the right way to test soil or water? And at what time are we going to do that? What's the workflow on that? So there's a lot of like workflow that we need to develop. And then we need remediation materials ready to deploy as well. So if we do think we want to try micro remediation in the zone, and we do the due diligence to figure out the right zone where we can have success, well then where are we getting them? Where are we getting the mycelium? What kind of substrate are we putting it on? Do we have, I have dreams like when the campfire hit this year, I thought, man, we needed that warehouse that's just stacked to the top with biodegradable wattles that's just waiting for the fire, and then we just deploy those wherever we need to in the state, and it's ready to go, and it's not a scramble at the last minute, because we know this is going to happen after every fire. The rainy season is going to come, and these issues are going to surface, and we need to document these systems. Each new fire crisis, we're asking the same questions every single time. So let's get clear on the proven protocol, so that we don't have to always ask the same questions. We have answers, we have a strategy, and we can implement it. And then in the end, it's experienced practitioners to lead the response efforts. And that really goes back to, well, how are these folks being funded, or are they volunteering, or how do we support experienced practitioners in order to step up and provide the knowledge and experience that they have, so that we can be successful through all this. Okay, that is it for me presenting on this. So now I'm gonna take Matthew. You've been had a bunch of stuff in here, so I'm gonna read through some of Matthew's comments. For those of you that are on, there's a few of you on here. If you have questions, add them. Ask your questions now. This video is going to live in this group. I'll pin it to the top, and then as people come up with questions, as new people join the group, we can point to this little webinar as a way for people to at least get the context about this, so that we're all on the same page, and then we can start building on all of this here. So some of the things Matthew's been putting out, and Matthew has been working with the campfire restoration camp up in Butte County, and let's see. Matthew says lack of native wildlife is #1 reason for brush buildup, and wild and livestock animals would be the best workers to getting our forests in better shape. So you're talking about management, talking about the loss of bear, the loss of elk, the loss of antelope, these managers of the system that would generally smash grass down into the ground, eat fuel, eat grass, or bears, they would manage fuel ladders and break up material and eat grubs and get that touching the ground where it can decompose. So we've seen. Hopefully, most of us have seen those videos of areas that were had good grazing practices versus areas that didn't, and it's not like a zone that was grazed isn't going to burn, but it's not going to be so flashy. It's not going to go up so fast and so hot. It's going to burn much slower and much cooler, which will cause a lot less damage. Matthew also says wattle maker machines would be more sustainable and cheaper, so you could hire locals who lost their livelihoods from the fire. We can get all kinds of straw for free and then add anything into the hopper, mycelium, biochar, compost. And that's exactly what we had in Sonoma County last year. We had 2 wattle machines functioning exactly like you say, Matthew. We were adding mycelium, we were adding biochar, we were adding compost, and that's how we were able to deploy so much of that. So yes, absolutely, that's clear. Matthew also says if every bioregion had a wattle making machine, we could kick them into action for these events to support near bioregions. Totally agree. Where can we get those? Where can we hook up wattle machines, right? Like, it's almost like we need a bunch of wattle machines that are somewhere in California that their only use is for fire response, and then wherever the fire is, there's a team that moves those over to that zone and starts making wattles locally. Let's see here. Irene says UC Davis is conducting long-term study of Sonoma County soil, water, air after the 2017 fires. Totally. And I know I was talking with Mimi Enright last year, who works with the UC Cooperative Extension, and they were really the main source for conducting, all the testing. And one of the challenges that we had was that because the fire was so widespread and because there were so many different groups taking action in different places, we weren't able to integrate the people who were doing testing with the folks who were doing remediation strategies. So we weren't able to bring those two together. And I think that ultimately what we need moving forward is an ability to bring these, to have that testing that is integrated with the remediation strategy so that we can really prove or disprove our different strategies there. And let's see, Matthews asked, was Sonoma fire under federal control? I'm not sure I understand that question totally, Matthew, but the fire burned on state land, on private property, not so much on federal land, if that's your question. Like I think the fire up in Butte County was a lot on national forests and stuff. That wasn't the case in Sonoma County. A lot of it was state controlled or local as well. And yes, Irene, I'll take this video and upload it to YouTube as well. I got to get my tech friend to help me with that and make it widely available. So other questions? There's a few of you here. Did I miss anything? Comments? Anything else we want to cover before we close this one down and move on with our evenings? So just let me know. I will just say that I'm really inspired to develop protocols for this work. I'm inspired to develop handbooks, to do education. And a lot of the work that I do nowadays is really more in this, is really more in the preventative realm currently, because I think that's where, if we're not responding to fire, then we need to be focusing on fuel load management, on good design, on water retention landscapes, and bringing regenerative stewardship, whether it's holistic rangeland, holistic grazing, or whatnot, prescribed fire. These are things that we need to be doing so that across the board so that we can mitigate the potential of another mega fire. And right here in Sonoma County, one of the things that I've been tracking is all the areas that are prone to fire that haven't burned for a few decades. And one of the ways you can do that, especially in Northern California, in the coastal California, is just go to your nearest redwood grove, because redwood is very resistant to fire. And so if you go to your nearest redwood grove and you see scorch marks, you're in a fire zone. The fire is going to return there. The fire's always going to return. These fires are not unnatural phenomenons. The fact that our fire season has extended from June to December, that's a little bit out of precedence as far as we know, and mostly likely driven by climate change. But the fact that the fires are happening at all, these fires have been happening for tens of thousands of years, which we've learned from the indigenous people in these communities who've been tracking fire for over 10,000 years. And so we know that fire zones are always going to burn again. And so one of the ways that we can look at prevention is to go out and track where fire has been in past history, look for scorch marks on trees, or just like do internet research about fire in your region. And if a fire has, if a forest fire or wildfire has happened in a certain zone, well, you pretty much know it's going to come back there. So then focus our energy there. Here in Sonoma County, Occidental is a zone that has burned in the past, and a lot of the redwoods have scorch marks on them, and it will burn again. Cazadero, we know intimately about the last big fire in Cazadero that burned tens of thousands of acres. It's a very hilly community, which would likely result in firestorms and fire tornadoes and stuff due to the topography. And that is just a nightmare when you go up there and see the amount of fuel load that's there. So I think these are the kinds of strategies that we need to be implementing now to reduce the effect of megafires into the future. So I've been talking for about an hour, and just trying to give you all as much context as I see it, as much inspiration about what's possible. I'll wait for any couple more minutes here to see if anyone else has any more questions or comments that you want to make in the comment section there. And otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up. And I will upload this to YouTube so that folks can share it around. So once I have that done, I'll link it into. I'll share the link in this group, and then you all are welcome to check it out from there. If there's still questions about any of this, or if there are folks who are excited to bridge the gap between crisis, to bridge the gap between fire to fire, in terms of organizing and planning, in collating all the things that we've learned in our different fire responses into something that we can give the next community that is on fire, let me know. Let's use this group as that. That's what this platform, this group is really, there's people literally all over the country and all over the world in this group. And so I kind of hope that this becomes a place where all the experts can show up and share what we learned and document what we're experiencing, and can use it as a way to weave across communities, weave across borders, so that we as a people, as humanity, can really change our relationship to fire, can see fire for the ecological health it brings, can understand why it's so destructive in our communities, and can design appropriately, manage regeneratively in a way to avoid mega fires happening again.